Hi all, welcome to the final section of the course, Style Sheets and UI Layout. Here we will strive hard to improve our front-end UI. Now we move on to the first video of this section, Less. Here we will learn what is less and then implement it. If you've worked with style sheets within the last few years, there's no chance you won't have heard of less. However, for the sake of those who didn't, let's take a few words to talk about it. Before getting to that though, we must briefly introduce the concepts of style sheet language and cascading style sheets, CSS. A style sheet language, also known as style language, is programming language used to define the presentation layer's UI design rules of a structured document. We can think of it as a skin or theme that we can apply to a logical item to change its appearance. For example, we can make it look blue, red, or yellow. We can make the characters bigger or smaller or thinner or wider. We can change the text, spacing, alignment, and flow, and so on. Using dedicated style sheet languages gives developers the chance to separate the presentation layer's code and structure from the UI design rules, thus enforcing the separation of concerns (SOC) principle within the presentation layer itself. It was December 17, 1996, when the World Wide Web Consortium W3C released the official W3C CSS recommendations for the style sheet language that would be known as CSS1. CSS2 came less than 2 years later, May 1998, while its revised version, CSS 2.1, took considerably more time, June 2011. Starting from CSS3, things started to become more complex, since the W3C ditched the single monolithic specification approach by splitting it into separate documents called modules, each one of them following its very own publishing, acceptance, and recommendation history. CSS3 quickly became the most adopted style sheet language standard for the development of new websites, regardless of their version, each adding new features while maintaining backwards compatibility with the previous ones. So let's come back to see what is less and why is it used. Less is a cascading style sheet preprocessor. We can think of it as a server-side script for CSS files, enabling us to do a number of things that CSS doesn't support yet, just like PHP and/or ASP can do for an HTML page. These are the main advantages of using a hypertext preprocessor instead of writing raw HTML pages. We're talking about PHP, but the same goes for ASP.NET Web Forms, Razor, and basically everything else. The advantages of using less instead of writing raw CSS files. As we can see, they serve the exact same purpose in terms of assisting, improving, and enhancing the development effort. Making the switch from static style sheets to dynamic style sheets is just as easy as switching from static HTML pages to PHP or ASP dynamic pages. They both feature a nested meta language that can extend the base static language in a pure, backward-compatible fashion. This means that a valid CSS file is also a valid less file, just as a valid HTML file is also a valid PHP or ASP file. We will now look at the features of less. Among the most valuable less features, there is variable support. Another less key feature is the capability of importing other CSS and less files. We will be able to nest selectors within other selectors, thus making our code more succinct and readable. It also supports mix-in feature that saves us a lot of time whenever we're dealing with large CSS files. Another great feature is the less extend pseudo class, which can be used to apply all properties of a class to another class. Less happens to be written in JavaScript, so installing it can be as easy as downloading the official less.js JavaScript library and letting its magic work without having to set up anything else. From the topmost menu, select Tools, Extensions, and Updates, and then click to the Online item tree to the left. Once there, start a search using the less compiler keyword and locate the less compiler by Mads Christensen. During the installation phase, you will be asked to quit and restart Visual Studio, so be sure to save everything before doing it. Once done, use the Solution Explorer to navigate to the app.component.css file and rename it to app webpack.component.less. A warning pop-up will appear, informing you that the file can become unusable and asking for a confirm. Choose Yes, and then open the new file. Here you will see this option. See the HUD-like screen near the lower right corner? This is how the less compiler tells us about what it will do upon build, either globally or for the currently opened file. Both settings can be changed by clicking on them. For our specific purposes, we just need to change the project settings value from off to on. Do that, and then update the file content by adding a single comment on top. Once done, save your file and look at the Solution Explorer to see what happens. The less compiler should automatically detect the updated content and compile the file accordingly. After a couple of seconds, you should see something like this. That's it. Our .less source file has been compiled into its corresponding CSS and min.css files. Before continuing, rename all the other component CSS files to give them the .less extension, like we just did with the app.component.css file. Alternatively, we can also change our existing Webpack configuration to make it compile the less files into CSS. To do that, first add a less loader to our existing Webpack configuration file. Then rename all our existing CSS files with less files with the same name. Finally, reference the less files in the components instead of the CSS ones. Choosing this path will require installing the Webpack less loader using NuGet. Then replace the appropriate rule in the webpack.config.js file. Such a method is absolutely viable. On top of that, since it will seamlessly integrate with the Webpack workflow, it will even save us the trouble of installing a separate tool. However, we didn't choose it because we wanted to actually be able to see the transformation between less and CSS syntax, which is a great deal for learning purposes.